There we go. Hey guys, sorry about the wait. Was just trying to size this team viewer window up right. So I'm in Logan's desktop right now. I'm gonna run it like this because we were having trouble with some hand history imports from Ignition. Um, so these hands are from 100NL Ignition, hand picked by Logan. Looks like we've got 27. Yeah, go ahead, Logan, or I guess I can because I've been coaching him for, I think we've had 3 lessons so far. Um, Things that I've noticed about his game. He was the guy that I mentioned last time about um, the rant that I went on about how to fix fancy play syndrome by channeling creativity into strategy development instead of FPS. So Logan would fall into the category of, I would say, sort of a unique over-aggressive player because I don't sense compensational aggressive tendencies about him. Like if I compare it to a different student who you guys know, Tim from the previous streams, Tim has very compensational, compulsive type of aggressive habits. Um, Logan, from what I can tell, just from meeting with him a few times, seems to come from a more balanced place in terms of emotionally centered, I would say. But his creativity gets the best of him and still forces him to do things that are unorthodox to the point where they get a little bit self-sabotaging, I guess I would say. So for you guys that are creative, think about the fact that you can only be so creative before you're just being stupid again, because your creativity is directly in line with how much someone understands that they're supposed to fold versus your aggression. Like if you think about most of your creative ideas that you have at the table, it's relying on the opponent to understand something that usually you're projecting onto him. Once you cross a certain threshold of creativity, you're starting to assume that the opponent is capable of understanding what you're doing that is so creative, and that's a dangerous place to be in because if you do something that flies over someone's head, now you've put yourself in a situation where you just leveled yourself. Um, so I posted that one hand at the beginning of the last stream where Logan like bluff raised the river going on a read that the guy was capped, and he was correct about the guy being capped, but the guy still didn't fold. So it's a good example of like you can be the best hand reader in the world, but if you blow your frequencies out of the water, or if you're just in an environment that doesn't have discipline to fold to begin with, your aggression's getting you nowhere. Yeah, I tried to do that last time, Zodi. Um, but unfortunately, it didn't seem to do anything. I was confused about it. If you know how to do it, let me know, but it doesn't seem to work just by clicking on off. And I reloaded the hands too, and it still didn't work. So we're just going to have to roll with it, I think. What's up, everyone? Okay, so we're heading into this with a little bit more context on the player, because like I said, I've been training Logan for probably 2 hours total, and he's also picked up both of the PO Unlocked packs, um, and also the mental game course. So he's pretty equipped with what I'm all about, and what we've been working on is basically fixing FPS um, and moving toward more deliberate, simplified hotspot strategies that he can just implement without much mental energy for now. Get to a point where he's beating 100NL at a decent clip, and then we'll stack the more refined stuff on top of it. So it's the same progression I'm going through with everyone I'm training. The difference is what stage does the student come in at dictates how subtly I start the lessons right off the bat. For instance, for my coaching for profits guys, I'm starting with a really simplified strategy, um, just to get them beating micros and get them reducing their strategic options a ton, just getting used to pulling aggressive triggers like consistently in spots that they can identify through pattern recognition. Um, So Logan's already pretty much beyond that point, I would say, for whatever reason. Came in a little bit higher up and took to the training of the first 3 lessons pretty well. So from here, it's still going to be a process of making sure that he plays rivers really well, which is always basically part of the program that I use with guys that doesn't ever get weeded out. If anything, the subtlety of the river decision tree or the subtlety of the river exploits just increases along the way. Um, but for the most part, I think what I'll focus on here is making sure that Logan's not making bad call-offs and not forcing aggression. Close and open again the window. All right, I'll try it. Oh shit, I closed out the team viewer. All right, one sec. See what you did, Zodi? Logan, see if you can do it, because I don't want to hit the wrong button. Maybe I can. Go ahead and reopen those hands, or I'm guessing this is still them. Okay, cool, it did work. I need an external monitor. First things first when I get to Vegas. I think that looks okay. All right, let's go. 27 hands, we'll try to get through all of them. Logan, if you've got analysis, paste it in the chat while I run it. This is a call. I'm trying to think how I know, because it's one of those things that is just subconsciously integrated. I would say that it's a combination of knowing that you have to discount him severely for aces, kings, queens when he uses a flat jam sizing, and then from there the rest is history, because once you discount aces, kings, queens at a substantial rate, the equity of tens just goes up so much that it's no longer close. So that's, I guess, a mass database analysis read. The fact that I just know that this sizing is not as consistent with aces, kings, queens as a smaller 4-bet sizing is. And I've not run data on that. It's just one of the things that I know from playing 10, 15 million hands lifetime that like I trust that read. So I don't think there's a lot of stuff that I do just based on intuitive MDA alone, but like this is one of them. And I think all you guys can kind of, if you've been around long enough, you know that this is much more weighted towards a spastic merged type bet, like either ace queen, ace king, sometimes even like jacks or lower pocket pairs maybe if he's really tilted, but definitely discounted premiums. I was talking to a student right before this who made a fold in a spot where someone was playing a line that shouldn't exist, similar to this. And I said, you really just have to be careful making folds based on the assumption that your range is perceived strong or something like that. Like in his case, that's what it was. But what you basically have to be careful of is making folds in spots where you're giving guys credit for having really strong ranges when they're using sizings that shouldn't exist or lines that shouldn't exist in the first place, because that's usually indicating that they're already doing something somewhat wild or that they don't have good understanding of range versus range dynamics. 9-9 is close. I think it's a lot closer than 10-10. I think I think it's close enough that I might still call if I had some sort of player read, but I think it's getting really close. I think that's how close it actually is, because if you think about it, like, because tens could be in his range, like tens is one of those merge hands that I think could play like that. So when you're looking at the difference between, and nines could also be in his range to play like that. So to flip tens and nines is like a huge equity shift. So yeah, I think it's It's weird because tens is a snap call, but then to move to nines is much closer than it seems. Do your data points and hotspots take bet sizes into consideration? I'll hear you say that people don't do X enough, but I was just wondering if that's taking into consideration how infrequently we need to be right when facing small bet size. Yeah, it's combined. So what I say sometimes is that what the community doesn't seem to understand about pot odds is that there's a psychological aspect of it that's almost binary. By binary, I mean there's a lot of guys out there, I would say the majority of the pool, that in certain spots, especially if we're going to look at river spots, will simply not be bluffing for certain sizings. I'm thinking about sizings under half pot at anywhere near an optimal bluffing frequency. So the things that are sort of counteracting that trip guys up is that when you see a smaller bet, you know that he's not allowed to be bluffing as much. So technically, it means that you need to be right less often before you justify a call. But when you add in the psychological aspect of it, it becomes still a clear fold because people are not nearly bluffing even up to the lower frequency that they need to match in order to be bluffing at a frequency that incentivizes you to call. So yeah, with pot odds, this day and age, at this stage of like where the industry is at, from small stakes to high stakes, um, not enough players are creative enough to be using small bet sizings with enough bluffs. And that actually makes sense because on the flip side, not enough players are disciplined enough to face a small bet size and find the fold often enough. The reason is most guys are operating from the paradigm that pot odds equal call. When I'm getting better pot odds, I should call more because I need to be right less often. And that filters back over into the enemy psychology of, okay, if they're not going to fold, I'm just not going to use this sizing as a bluff. So it's almost that simple. Um, and I don't know how much, I've run a decent amount of MDA on sizings, I think, at some point. Um, but to me, it's almost one of those intuitive things too that like the small bet sizings are so rarely a bluff. Like you saw that that lesson with Philippe, I think it was the last one on Monday, the last volunteer one we did. And that was one of the main leaks that I thought he had was not using the bet size indicator on the river to trump all other mass data, to trump all over data point reads along the way. Like as soon as someone puts out that river sizing, that's very, very unorthodox in the sense that it's not used often enough with bluffs. I wouldn't say it's unorthodox as a system, but it's imbalanced because it doesn't use bluffs often enough with it. That's the point at which you have to just cut the entire decision tree out and be like, okay, I had data points up to this point in the hand, but this one is the most telling because this one is more inclusive than all the rest in terms of it trumps all of them, I guess you could say. My reads are locked up on the laptop you're using. Ah, okay. Maybe you can, if you want, Logan. Oh, I guess you can't paste in the Skype either. So how are you typing in the chat? If I need to, I'll just give you control of the computer for a second and you can, this one's like the same thing. So this is even worse. Now it's a flat jam. And I would say this is even spazzier because now I'm for sure discounting like a lot of his like aces through jacks, I would say. So now I think nines is a clear call. Also, like I would include more random shit in his range here to just be open jamming. The point at which any amount of low pocket pairs enter his range, nines becomes like a really clear call. Yeah, you can type your reads if you want, if you think it's relevant enough. So I think this is good. Call 3-bet. Check call flop looks fine. That's a tough spot. You're drawing to reverse implied odds. You're facing a button 3-bet that most likely was too narrow pre-flop to begin with based on how the pools play. And also you're looking at a board where very few players will barrel naked and very few players will have enough bluffs left in their range to be balanced, especially since most of their bluffs will be very equity driven at this point. So I think in practice this is actually much closer than it is in theory. Like in theory, it's a really easy defense. I'm guessing it would be called not raised, but I definitely think it gets way closer on account of the fact that I don't think he was three betting enough pre-flop. I don't think that he's bluffing enough on the turn on account of that, and I also think a lot of his bluffs, most of his bluffs are very equity driven, reverse dominating us. Um, so all those things. I think this is a mistake. Whether or not it would ever be jammed in theory is not really important to me. If I make the read that I'm up against a range that's not bluffing enough and also very equity driven, I'm not interested in playing a check raising range. I'm going to try to realize my equity by either check calling or I'm just going to ditch out and chalk it up to kind of a cuspy exploitative fold. So I think I would most like to see you check fold here, even though a lot of theory players would be aghast at that. But I think my reasons are good. Button 3-bet is narrower on average for the alias pool. We're dealing with a monotone double Broadway board where he probably won't have enough bluffs to begin with, and most players are not bluffing with enough non-club X hands. So I think we're going to be up against a very narrow equity pushing turn barrel range with reverse domination. From a mental game perspective, I also think you're prone to be complicating mistakes on this river. Like if an ace falls, I could see that you'd talk yourself into check calling when I actually think that would be really bad. If a club falls, I could see you talk yourself into check calling when I actually think that'd probably be bad. Since he's so short on bluffs and he's equity driven, meaning that a flush completing river would probably plant him with just a bunch of nut flushes and a bunch of hands that check back and maybe the occasional bluff. So it's actually multiple aspects where I think it's technically a good fold, meaning from the technical point of view of range versus range reads. And then because I think you're going to play the river poorly on a bunch of different cards, because your context is not subtle enough to be able to maneuver through the minefield, I would rather see you cut your losses and fold turn. Weird hand though. I doubt a lot of people would I don't know a lot of circles that I could find myself in where people wouldn't laugh if you said this was a check fold, but I trust myself here. Not a lot of circles are operating with the type of mass database analysis that I think that we're working with. The one weird question is, do you have fold equity on ace king? That's actually probably the most relevant point to bring up for bluff raising. I think I would bet fold ace king black. Because yeah, even if a player is doing some of this sometimes, it doesn't mean that he's bluffing at a balanced rate. It doesn't mean he's bluffing at a frequency that's incentivizing me to call, especially when his bluffs are pushing a lot of equity. So that might be your best argument, is if you thought you had fold equity versus ace king, this could sort of tip back over into a good bluff strategy, because now he doesn't have to be bluffing, he can be folding better. Now the question is, how assumptive is it that a player bet folds ace king? Well, I think it's relatively assumptive at these stakes, and I wouldn't put my stack on it. Basically, I wouldn't bet a stack on it. I know it's like a simplified way of putting it, but you get what I mean. I'm not going to do something that I think would be normally bad, hinging on the assumption that I could get him off of ace king. I think that's how you sort of compound errors. So we can mark that one, Logan. What do you want me to mark this as? I'll just do that. Fucking up your whole world. I would say ace queen off is definitely a profitable call. I think it's closer than it would be. I think ace jack is a fold versus the environment 3-bet there, middle position versus button, but I think ace queen is strong enough. I agree though, it is closer than um, than it seems. And you could probably find some players at the limit that it would be a fold against. I'm just working with like the environmental button 3-bet range that we see there. This looks bad. I'm not really ready to call here versus any player because I'm only getting 1.5 to 1. And I think the range that he's going to have to be jamming there is going to need to have us. Let me think. This is kind of like an MTT hand. I'm going back to like the types of ranging that I used to use in MTTs to try to figure out how much equity a hand like King Queen has it all in. I'm pretty sure that we don't get there if we dominate. Like even if we dominate a substantial amount of pocket pairs, I'm not sure if we're there yet. If he has King Queen some of the time, it helps, but my gut tells me that we actually need to have some minor amount of domination, and he's got to be jamming a substantial amount of pairs that we flip against. So I feel like this is in the department of could be relatively break even or more likely ends up being negative EV depending on what type of confidence interval we devise versus this guy. Like you're going to be up against some guys here who only jam ace jack plus pocket nines. You might even be up against a profile who jams only tighter than that. So you have to figure out how much of the pool is that guy compared to how much of the pool is the maniac who will sometimes jam king jack offsuit and all pairs. And when you combine those or average them, I don't think it looks all that good. It might only be costing you like, $5 or so on the call, but I think it's a little too light. King Queen suited, I think, actually gets a lot closer because you pick up another few percent equity. So I would 3-bet fold there. Or you could just flat. Yeah, I agree that zone is like the hotspot pool for MDA blueprint exploits. Single raise pop multi-way. Logan's just checking range on the flop as a simplified strategy here. I don't mind the check raise. I think it's verging on an overplay because we're multi-way, but I think you're going to be able to recover decently well. This guy's half stacked. I mean, yeah, this guy's half stacked, and if this guy re-raises over the top, we have an easy fold, I think, even though I don't think a re-raise range should really exist for him. So yeah, I think this is, from an exploitative standpoint, it's fine. From a theoretical standpoint, I don't know because we can't solve multi-way flops, but I think that there's definitely incentive for you to be raising for protection / value. There's no real way to term it unless you use some sort of hybrid terminology like that, because the mistake would be to move into the territory of like, well, this is a tier 2 hand. Like if you were working under the assumption that there's only a few different types of hands, or like there's 4 different types of hands, like that kind of gets you in trouble when things become subtle enough that you have to sort of merge 2 different concepts of hand value or ranking together to find the action that's, I think, more incentivized. So here it's like, yeah, you're getting a good deal of value, but you're also getting a good deal of realization protection from 2 players in position who probably have a decent amount of overpaired or overcards in their distribution. And I don't even think that like Dimitri deleted sin in the chat says, wouldn't you rather check raise a wet board? Isn't that hand quite strong to check raise in a board people fold quite often? Yeah, so that's why it's, so Dimitri's recognizing this board as a hotspot for a check raise bluff. That being said, we are up against 2 players with a hand that's vulnerable versus 2 runouts, like a turn and river runout. So for instance, if I had a hand like pocket nines here, that would be a hand I would never check raise, because not only do I block top pairs, but I'm also nutted. You don't have that though. You have a marginally strong overpair that's susceptible to getting sucked out on by 2 players that likely have a heightened distribution of overcards. So I'm more in the camp of playing the check raise out of position right now with this type of hand, even though I would expect that it's a spot where they could be folding too often. That being said, we also have to add the data point that it's multi-way. So this moves away from the heads up hotspots that we know. It's likely that this doesn't get overfolded. It's likely that if two players in the pot here, one of them calls often enough with a dominated pair that this is totally fine. It's actually like fat value or thick value to be getting with pocket tens in this spot. So it's a good example of a context leap that's unavoidable once you just have the type of data points in a hand that are subtle enough to introduce it. So what I've been doing with Dimitri is focusing on very deliberate hotspot points that build from a nice foundation that he can implement without much mental energy. But then a hand comes up like this, and it will confuse that player momentarily because it almost breaks the rule. But at that point, all we can really do is start to create exceptions to the rule. So it's the most interesting part of what I'm trying to do as a coach right now, because I feel very strongly that the simplified foundation needs to be laid in a way that is able to fit the current paradigm that the guys are operating from. In other words, they're operating from a pretty low level of understanding range versus range dynamics and even hand versus range. So I have to start with something that fits that, and then the only way out of that, like the only way to correct that process, is to eventually scale to exceptions to rules. So guys that train with me, the disclaimer is basically, we will simplify for highest accuracy at any stage in your development, and know that you will be introduced to things that almost contradict what we've said, but really they're actually just exceptions to rules. I'm not a big fan of having to completely warp or rework someone's entire paradigm to get them to the next limit. I'm more in the camp of like, okay, we have these ground rules, now let's introduce the tweaks that sort of refine it. Yeah, free coaching, Dimitri. What differences could you point between multi-way and heads up in this spot? The enemy unit range is stronger. That's how I visualize it basically. I think it's the most deliberate or relevant way to visualize it, because yeah, even though those guys are playing two different ranges, what you're looking at is it's basically more pair heavy. The unit range is more pair heavy. It's also more, well, let's think about this. In terms of the distribution of their range, that's what we're really concerned with. I think the main thing that's most relevant is that you're going to get through less often in terms of making both of them fold. So if you can see that, then I think it becomes less of a hotspot to check raise bluff. That being said, like we've seen consistent folds made in multi-way pots in this spot by guys who have like 9x. Like we've seen guys fold 9x consistently. I remember before we had MDA, it was the main thing that we were looking for. And actually, me and one of my other buddies would term this as a bluff hotspot still because of the types of pairs that we saw them folding. Like to fold a 9 here, I think is kind of criminal. Just because if you start doing it, like for one of them to fold a 9 to a check raise, if they start doing that, you're immediately incentivizing the pre-flop raiser to just go apeshit check raising for the most part. So you can look at it a couple different ways. When I think that they're much more pair heavy as a unit than they would be if we were heads up, intuitively it seems like we'll get through less on the bluff. But then when you look at the type of shit that they're actually folding in the replayers, it could still make sense to check raise Jack 10 heart here, like religiously. So no real good answer unless you have enough mass database analysis to support the pure exploit. But there are qualities of the hand we can look at in terms of our hand is definitely getting some value when it gets called on the check raise, and also benefits from protection versus two enemy players who are drawing pretty live against it. Those to me make it a decent check raise spot. So let's see. The weird part about this is you have to be careful what you get yourself into now in terms of potentially compounding a bloated pot error. There's no error yet, but if you misplay versus the wrong player profile, you could make a big mistake. So who am I calling off against? I'm calling off against the major fish, and he would have to be a super major fish. He'd have to be a fish that I'd seen merge jamming. That would be a really helpful note to have on someone. I would never fold versus anyone who I saw was sort of like merge betting around. Like if I had a read on him that he had donk merged at some point, or that he had made a merge jam, that would be the best read that I could see, because then you can expect him to show up with hands like 7-8 suited, 9-8 off. But readless, there's no way I'm calling here, because I don't think that that guy makes up enough of the pool to be messing with. Keep in mind also, you can be up against jacks and queens here at some frequency, depending on how much he 3-bets those hands. So tens are definitely different than queens in this spot. This is a zone pool. You don't know if he's merged or polar. If I had more profile reads on the breakdown of the zone pool, you could almost argue for a vacuum call if you thought, like, here's the weird thing about this hand. I said in the very beginning, a re-raise for this player really shouldn't exist. So at that point you have to wonder, what the hell is he doing raising a set in this spot? So this is a weird, it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, where like, if people are taking lines that shouldn't exist, then at what point do you start to ask, how much credibility should I give him for the value hand in this line when the value shouldn't be played this way on a rainbow board, especially with the fish behind him? So it's actually an important data point. The question is, how much credibility do we give it? Because it's kind of assumptive territory to go down to say, well, this guy would never jam 9s, 6s, deuces. Because what if he just doesn't know that? But if he doesn't know that, then he more likely could be jamming merged, because he doesn't probably know much at all if he doesn't know that. I think it's a pretty big mistake for him to jam a set here, just from like a, I guess you could say, a theory-oriented point of view, but also exploitative. Like, he's got the button behind him that could make a ton of mistakes with a lot of different hands if he just flatted. It really doesn't make sense to force the button off of what would be a very clear mistake with a call had the UTG plus 2 just flatted. So this is kind of interesting, because those are the two things that are counteracting each other. I don't have enough data in a vacuum to say that the pool is comprised of enough guys that this is a call in a vacuum. Yet I'm also not that ready to assign him for a set in a spot where I don't think a set should be jammed. So the question becomes, which one of those is projecting too much? Do you think it's more assumptive that this guy is merge jamming at a high rate, and for that we need some sort of like Bayesian tendency of the pool? Or do you think it's more assumptive to think that he's not capable of showing up with a set with a jam? I'm not ready to say he can't have a set. I do want to kind of discount the amount of sets, but if he's not the type of guy that merge jams hardly ever here, then it doesn't matter if he's slightly discounted on sets. Like, that's the weird thing about how profiles work. If he's not the type of guy that would ever jam a 9x, then it doesn't matter if he has slightly less amount of sets and is discounted for some sets, you're still crushed. So I think the most important data point is he really has to be known as the type of guy who's capable of merge jamming before you can argue a call here. And that's when you can resort to maybe an alias profile read, like how much of the pool makes up of guys that would merge jam. And then if you have that read, it can help you in a spot where he's very, very polarized, assuming he doesn't jam jacks, but we can't even make that assumption too. So I think we have to fold tens, because the possibility he could show up with jacks here if he is a merge jammer significantly weakens our hand. If we had queens, I think it'd be a lot closer. I have to find the fold here without information. I think it's an important data point that could go overlooked. A lot of guys might only be looking at sets for the merge jammer, but the merge jammer could also have dominated value that he's mistakenly playing all the same, but that squashes your tens. So I think it's kind of a subtle data point that if you're too narrow in your focus, you might miss. But I think it's actually pretty relevant that if he has jacks and queens in his range and he was the merge jammer, now he has 12 extra value combos, and it makes it harder for him to even be imbalanced, even if he's using some 9x. Kind of a cool hand. We called the rip, yeah, and he called pre-flop. So I think this is a little bit too assumptive. single raise pot, player on the big blind is donking out, especially with this SPR and especially with the tendencies of donk bettors to complicate errors to the turn. I see no reason to put in a raise here. And it's basically as simple as I think we can force our opponent to make larger mistakes versus our exact hand if we just flat. Basically, anytime he's bluffing, anytime that he would bet fold with a weak pocket pair on the flop that might just launch off into the turn or just check call on the turn, that would be something I don't want him to do. I don't want to lose future value off of his dominated pairs. But mainly just like the bluffs. I expect the semi-bluffs that aren't really all that well randomized to do a lot of turn blasting. He's not donking? Oh, my bad. Oh, he's min 3 betting. Okay, so we have to call. Now we have to call. And I'm basically, yeah, I'm calling all turns here. I think that the double two-tone board actually helps our case in terms of giving us just a little bit more equity versus Broadway suited hands that he could show up with. I do think he's the most of the alias profile that min 3 bets as a short stack is going to be very, very strong on the 3 bet to begin with. That being said, I don't think that we can find the fold. I think it's close. I think it's way closer than it looks. Now we're not getting great odds either. For this price, it could almost be a fold if we had enough reads that the alias 3 bet short stacks are just super lights out, like, 3% plus. It's UTG versus big blind, which is a relevant data point. What up, Moss? Welcome to the stream. Thanks for that email. So this one I'm going to sort of let slide because I'm just not so sure what the mass database read would be on the alias in terms of, like, this is how refined you can get with MDA if you want. You can do alias work on the portion of the pool that's playing 50 BBs or whatever and 3 betting, versus UTG, get a percentage for that, and then kind of match that up with the line post flop and be like, does ace 9 likely have enough equity versus a guy who's blasting twice with this type of pre-flop range? And if you find out that he would have to be basically like bluffing the vast majority of hands in his range twice on the flop and turn to incentivize you to call, you're probably looking at a confidence interval where you're better off just maybe even just, I doubt you can fold the flop, because if he's c-betting something like overcards and then gives up, you naturally get to showdown often enough. But then what you don't know is how often he barrels twice, and then that becomes a guessing game, and it becomes more like a confidence interval game. And I would say that the tighter his pre-flop range is to begin with in terms of the mass database analysis, the more you're going to have a hard time arguing that you should be going call, call. Now you have texture things too, which is that the more suited Broadway diamonds or spades that barrel off here, the more reasons you have to call. And that's why I'm sort of saying maybe we can let it slide, because I think he has a lot more natural turn jams, having more potential suited, ace, queen, ace, king type hands, maybe even king, queen suited type hands that could be drawing live against you but still be incentivizing you to call here. What did Brian say about that? He said 3-bet min from a fish might be too chaotic to accurately map. I think the best data point in that hand is that it's UTG versus big blind, the spot that gets 3-bet most rarely for all profiles. And then you see him min 3-betting, which I think is what Brian is saying is kind of the volatile spot. But it's hard, because at what point do we fold? Like, that's how the hand gets sort of compounded into error, is that we certainly can't fold pre-flop. We certainly can't fold the flop because we don't know that he's going to be bombing off the turn, even if he was merge betting flop a ton. And then once he does bet the turn, that's the point of the hand where we're like, okay, well, what does the range look like here? How much confidence can we assign to the fact that he's still blasting either something dominated? I doubt he can have like pocket eights very often there, or even something like 9-10 suited, maybe. So then it comes down to how often is he launching with flush draws or just like a random ace queen or ace king, and I think it gets pretty assumptive. What's up, Cubic? Um, we're uploading all those onto YouTube. They'll be there permanently, so you can catch up on all of them. This guy's donking turn. I don't think I would call here. I think I'd be raising or folding. I think I would just fold, or I would raise to barrel river. My reasoning being that if you look at the sort of the texture, it's pretty hard for him to have a lot of unpaired hands. So I think what you're dealing with for the most part is some draws that are unpaired, and then a bunch of pair plus draws, and then a portion of two pair plus. It's not really a range I want to be floating against because I don't see a lot of his pair plus draw plotting to check fold river. I think most of the guys that would play this line with a hand like Jack 10 or something are going to check call the river after you float. So I'm not all that interested in that. The reason this would be good as a float would be as if you thought he had an abundance of bluffs or one pair hands that would shut down on the river and then proceed to check fold. But I think that's too assumptive in terms of, I think it's too ambitious to hope for. So what I think actually happens here is that we put ourselves in a spot where we either get blown off by a bluff on the river too often because we just don't improve often enough with just a gutter and middling second pair, drawing to a middling second pair. We don't improve enough, and then he doesn't check fold a pair enough either if he does decide to go into like a protection mode on the river with a hand like King Queen or Jack 10, or maybe even 10-9. So I'm folding turn because my hand does not have enough. My hand does not have good enough equity to play for the peel, and I don't see that the prospects of taking the pot away on a future street are good enough. Possibility that you could like massively overbet when he checks the river and maybe get him off some of that pair plus, or that if he donks the river you could rip, but I don't really have great confidence around that either, because anybody who's already playing a line like this I'm not sure is stable in terms of being able to bet fold stuff like Queen Jack, King Queen on the river. So this is not the type of player I'm trying to exploit with aggression on a texture like this, because I'm not trying to make him do anything. I'm not trying to make him fold at a super high rate with the type of hands that I think he's repping. Now, if I thought that he had a wider distribution of unpaired hands in his range, maybe raising turn gets much better. But as of now, I think we can't call, so we have to decide if we're going to raise or fold. I definitely like raising to barrel better than raising to give up. I think raising to give up is kind of our worst option. I think we're going to get peeled a ton. So I think we either have to fold or we have to raise to blast. And I think raising to blast off might be a little ambitious without reads on the player. Because like you could just be walking into someone who never has any intentions of folding, you know, Queen Jack or King Queen. I think we do have to bet this card because it weakens enough of his merged donking range. So it's kind of like the exception that now, yeah, we can definitely bet at this one. And I think I would bet large just to try to get extra fold equity on a king, especially since it's a river where we're very low on bluffs usually. Like it's really hard for us to find enough bluffs here on this runoff. So I think I might bet like 24 here, and I think that works pretty well versus a recreational player to get him to like side fold with a king. And I'm guessing this guy's a rec because that sizing shouldn't exist on the turn. My goal behind betting larger is to hopefully get a disproportionate amount of fold equity from the portion of his range of like King, Queen, King 10. I doubt you're going to make that hand fold though for an overbet. You don't need to justify it. That's the thing is that, yeah, like the $11 bet is still going to get the folds from the Jack and 9x region, so it gets a better price point on that. But at the point at which he would fold like 90% of the time or more, and has a substantial amount of king X in his range, I think you're going to lean toward overbetting being a little bit better. I actually would flat here. I think it'd be a mistake to fold getting 4-1. So sometimes guys ask me, what do you value more, getting pot odds pre-flop or being up against less players pre-flop? Because yes, we're getting 4-1, but we're also out of position versus 3, potentially 4 players going to the flop. I don't think there's really a way to solve that unless you want to go into the lab and get pretty assumptive with pre-flop stuff, which I've never been good at or had much interest in. I tend to try to solve things by going one step further into territory I'm more familiar with. So I'm like, all right, well, getting 4-1 with Queen Jack can't be that bad of a call. Now, do I have post-flop skills that I can parlay over to exploits on future streets that I can justify makes the EV higher than it should be in theory? And of course I do. So most of my cuspy pre-flop calls, that people might think are marginal, to me are justified because I understand the landscape of the post-flop game well enough to know that I can deploy in spots where I can pick up extra win rate, where other guys would probably miss it. By the way, I was watching my streams the other day, cutting them for the key parts that I want to re-upload to YouTube, and I noticed my favorite unconscious motion is this one, which apparently gets used for a lot of different things, some that make zero sense. But I think I want to specifically reserve this for when I'm indicating some sort of paradigm shift, and I'm going to put more attention on it. I don't want to overuse it, and I don't want to become that guy that's only got one move. This looks like a clear check call. I think you could make arguments for donking the turn, but it doesn't really interest me because I don't know enough about four-way pots on this specific texture to be able to argue that donking would be much better. So yeah, I think this is fine. The question is, would we check call that river? I think it'd probably be a check fold, just because I don't think that line's going to get bluffed enough. And I doubt he's going to be value betting a dominated hand often enough. Kind of would be an above the rim fold, I think. And he'd be UTG. It's all good. Okay, so we're up against a guy who's check calling and donking. We've talked a couple times already today. I led off with that discussion that I had with the student where he ended up making a fold in a similar line to this where it was check call donk donk because of the fact that he didn't think that the guy would be trying to move him off of a range that was perceived so strong. So if you think about Button's range here, it's extremely well protected, especially on the king. Now I doubt a donking range should exist here for small blind if he does play a check call only strategy on the flop. So what is the difference now when you're holding king queen to compare to if you're holding ace queen? I think there's a substantial one. There's a lot of extra room for him to be doing something stupid in a line that already makes very little sense. Where if you had ace queen, you'd have much more domination or split equity on that stupid move that he's making. The reason that I think I would fold right here is that I think that we have a decent amount of confidence facing the small blind that he really can't have bluffs in his range here. Like, unless he has like the occasional queen nine suited of club or something like that. So it's similar to the queen eight hand from 2 hands ago, where it's like I don't see enough prospects to call and get to free showdown, and I also don't see enough prospects to call and then blast him off an ace on the river, and I definitely don't see enough prospects to go call. So I think I'm just finding the fold here, and I would probably go call with any ace. This is a fold. Okay. I would chalk that up to just an anomaly, and it's probably the most valuable note that you could take on a player at the table, because this is your. I used to label this type of guy as my 9. It was a note that I could make very quickly that would indicate that he was my target. Basically, someone who had done something so ridiculous that I could no longer make any sort of intelligent reads or folds versus him in the future. Really, the intelligent read you make versus this type of player in the future is I can't fold anything to him. Yeah, I guess I always do advocate folding river a lot. But it's because this doesn't happen at a very high rate. Like, this is an anomaly. So, the type of hands that I would advocate calling would be hands that tied with his perceived value range as the type of fish who's using a line that shouldn't really be used to begin with. The difference between weak ace-x and king-queen here is like massive. So that's the main thing I'm going on, is that like the next best hand up from king-queen is the weak ace, yet the equity difference between king-queen and ace-x is like a ton. I'm not assuming that he never checks river. I'm assuming he doesn't check river often enough with a weak enough hand that allows us to get to showdown for free, enough to incentivize us to call turn. So basically, I'm applying theory to get to that conclusion, because in order to call for the odds that we're getting on the turn, we need to believe that we're getting checked to often enough on the river, and that we can also check back and win often enough. So it's both. And unless you're going to include a substantial amount of bluffs in his range from the turn, you're not going to be able to create a model where you can get what you need for the turn call. So you could devise a range for him that bet turn wide enough and then checked river wide enough, but I think that range is going to be extremely assumptive when applied back into any sort of player profile who's doing that consistently in the pool. This player obviously being an exception. How long before you come off the 9 reads? If I see something that's blatant enough, like this would be a really big anomaly that would catch my eye, and I would put the 9 read on him, and then I probably would never go back on it for at least the rest of the session. Like as soon as someone shows you something so stupid, they can play 30 or 50 hands okay after that, and I'm still going to have the note on them that like I really have to be careful giving this guy credibility in lines where he bluffs river. I think that if he's merge betting a king, yeah, that's something he could be doing, but he also has a lot of ace-x and 10x and queen-jack that stomp you. So I don't know that we can justify calling just based on a king. See, that's more of a conceptual equity read, and I'm not saying that I can do it in any way that's like mathematically lights out. But like I don't think that it's sound to justify that it's hard to, like when you say it's hard to fold the turn because we could split with a king, that's a little bit narrow of a mentality, because look at how much ace-x and 10x you could have. Whereas if you had an ace, now you have a lot more leeway to make a statement like it's kind of hard to fold an ace because look at how much ace-x and even king-x, which we now dominate, he has. So it's just shifts like that, and looking at the way the ranges sort of interact, where like I don't think I get enough equity just from him potentially merge jamming a king, merge betting a king on the turn, and then I don't even have full confidence that I'm going to get checked to on the river so I can free showdown. You have to understand, with guys who are volatilely betting the turn in spots where they shouldn't, with merge bet hands that they shouldn't, it's assumptive to even think that he'll check king jack on the river, because he was supposed to check it on the turn. So now you're potentially putting yourself in a situation where you're calling turn to fold river versus a hand that you're still tying against. I think that I would very rarely be calling turn to fold river in these types of spots, even though I think that the reason I'm recommending you do it here is because I think you already made a mistake on the turn, and now you're just correcting the turn mistake. So I think the turn fold is right. And if any hand that I was calling turn with, I would be calling river with. Exceptions would be if you had like a hand that was like more of a live draw, which I don't think you have here with king queen having only a gutter. But you guys get what I mean. Like if you have an 8 or 9 out draw, clearly now you have reason to call turn with some hands to fold river. Is it a trap for us who are beginning to use MDA to keep us from trusting our previous database analysis? Well, what is your previous database analysis? Is it stuff that you intuit to be true that's actually not corresponding with what's really going on in the environment? So basically what I'm saying is you can't even say you've done legitimate database analysis until you've done mass database analysis, unless you've been doing some sort of unique profiling on certain aliases. So let's attack the question at the root, is what I'm saying. It's not a trap to use MDA if it's overriding assumptions that already existed in your framework. And I think that's probably like the progression that most guys go through, is that they thought the environment worked a certain way from whatever database work they'd done so far, or whatever confirmation bias they had assimilated into their framework. And then the mass database analysis is something that shows them over very wide samples, over very pressed out samples, that they actually were thinking about it incorrectly. They actually had a distorted view. So let's see what you're saying. I mean, there are always outliers, especially at lower stakes. Seeing 5-5 here and then thinking your fold is wrong. So I think what you're saying is, at what point, like the trap would be to be looking through your hand analysis. I'm still reading what you're saying. Hold on. You're saying I'm probably too results oriented. It's more likely he's afraid of missing value on the turn and that he's just spazzing. I don't think we even need to enter what his thought process is. What we need to determine is how often does this player exist in the pool. And if this is truly an anomaly, then it doesn't infringe on the MDA analysis that we do. Because like this is the inclusive level to get to, is to realize that the anomalies exist within the MDA. That's how you solve the question at the root. It dissolves into the mass database analysis. If you get too focused on what the anomalies mean in terms of potentially challenging the MDA results, you're forgetting that the anomalies actually exist within the MDA results. So it's almost like it bothers me very little to see showdowns like this, because it's already been accounted for in the inclusiveness of my research. Where if you're not operating from a level that's that inclusive, I know, firsthand, especially, that it gets easy to distrust yourself because you're wondering, are my reads actually right? Is my idea of the pool actually right? So when I mentioned that back in end of 2015, when I first started experimenting with installing more of an independent learning process and just making the commitment to start calibrating a little bit faster based on what I was seeing from Bovada shown hole cards, I didn't have mass database analysis to go on. So I was basically just doing it on intuition, looking at the pots I was losing, and then trusting that because I was seeing hole cards, the results orientedness of it was a little bit more acceptable than if I didn't have hole cards. So for instance, if I went over a session and I was like, wow, shit, the guys who donk bet were bluffing 3 out of 5 times in that session, I would keep an eye on this stuff, and over the course of the week I would try to make notes and try to keep sort of a balanced viewpoint of it, and then I would make aggressive corrections to my strategy based on what I was seeing through results. So that's sort of the caveman way of doing it, and that's where I was at a year ago before I basically went in and did MDA, before we had the capacity to do it, basically. So that's the difference, is like, yeah, you can do it based on feel, but it's going to be much more subject to error. I just knew that that was the direction I wanted to experiment with, because I was fed up with going about it the theory-oriented way, which seemed to be just as pinned under assumption, because it didn't try to didn't try to implement the environmental tendencies at all, which I thought was equally as shitty. What do you got for me, Logan? Here's my biggest problem with getting behind the turn fold, Logan says. We frequently talk about merged fishy donk bets. During the hand, as soon as I see the donk, I think, okay, he's merge betting and I'm probably beating most of his merge range. Yeah, but I think so this is a good point, and it's one of those points where I'll say we're scaling into a higher context or exception to the rule, and it's going to be especially resistant because of the hand that he shows down. So this is the point where you either have to trust what I'm telling you as someone who's probably played more hands than you and looked at more hands, or you have to know your environment better than me and say, Nick, I override this because you just don't know what's going on in my environment. So there is a texture thing going on here where when the board is ace 10 10 king, I think that there's much less merged hands in his range consisting of what he shows. Main part being because a lot of guys would just fold a pocket pair straight up on the flop and not even have them in their range here. But there's also there's a difference between merge betting on ace 10 10 king and ace 8 4 deuce. I don't know how to quantify exactly what that difference is, but I know that it's definitely tangible. And I know that the low pocket pair bet is going to be less frequent on a texture like this. So can I give you exact textural reads? No. But can I tell you that every bone in my body says you'll be over applying the bluff catch if you put people on low pocket pair in the spot consistently? Yes. So it's one of those spots where you can either trust my way or override and do it your way, and we'll see 100,000 hands from now, which we'll never actually be able to get because this spot doesn't come up often enough. The balance to me not being able to have the mass data analysis to show you that what I believe to be true actually is true would just be for you to play a theory-oriented style. The problem with that is that the theory-oriented system will have you functioning under assumption that you should be calling turn to fold some rivers away. Where if you actually did the math on how often this river was checked when guys merge bet the turn, you would see you never actually have incentive to call to fold because you never see free showdown enough. That I'm pretty confident about, that most merge bettors are donking through the hand. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make nearly as much sense as it does in theory to call turn to fold river. So either way you look at it, you have to exit a theoretical model, because in a situation where you don't get to free showdown often enough, you have to make your decision of whether or not you're going with the hand on the turn. So then it's basically your call. Do you think that enough merged hands get shown here? The reason I'm saying no is because I think there's a big difference between an ace 10 10 king board and other boards in terms of how often a low pocket pair gets initially check called and then donked on the turn. And I don't think that it's a huge leap to make. Like, I don't think that that's really like a gigantic assumption to make. The reason there'll be a lot of resistance around it is because in front of us right now we have a hand where someone showed a pocket pair. But this is where I think it takes a little bit more maturity and posture as a player to be able to be like, okay, how often is this guy really in the pool doing stuff like this? How often is someone so recklessly disregarding texture altogether and making a play with this type of hand? I think it would be more assumptive to say that someone has no idea that this texture should discourage him from doing that with a pocket pair more than others. Though I don't really feel like arguing or discussing it any longer, because I understand that my position is based strictly on intuition. So at the end of the day, the only thing that we have to go on is to trust the fact that I say that my confirmation bias is not too heavy to say that this should be a fold always. Like, clearly I'm aware that I have confirmation bias, but I still trust myself enough to think that this is a consistent fold, I guess. I'm trying to think of something that will be settling, because when we don't have MFA, usually it's we should play balanced. Yet we can't play balanced when we have enough MFA to show that they'll bet turn and fall through river too often. So the best I can offer is whatever hand that you decide is a turn call should also be a river call, based on the parameters of how often people continue to fall through after they donk turn. And I think if we can agree on that, then it's up to you guys what type of bluff catching strategy you want to implement versus your pool, and it should be based on how frequently you see mistakes like this made. It's a pretty big mistake. The other data point is that he's small blind, not big blind, so he could potentially have a tighter range than big blind. Maybe you could say that if it was versus big blind, I would be more prone to bluff catch it because he could have more weak stuff. You shouldn't trust me more than yourself. It's counterintuitive. You should and you shouldn't. I'm just being tricky now. I'll say this. If you're working with a coach who you trust, you should trust his reads better than you. But you should never trust someone to substitute for your resonance as an independent learner. All my shit I think is good, but at the point at which you decide that it doesn't resonate for you, it will always be a more accelerated path for you to go into whatever direction you need to clarify that resonance for yourself. Because if there's something I tell you that you feel very strongly against, and I know that's like a micro aspect because it's just a hand that we are sort of wondering what his range is, but like if there was something in the learning pattern that didn't resonate with you that I was trying to install into your game, I would hope that you didn't take it from a standpoint of like, well, Nick said I have to do it, so I'm just going to do it even though I don't feel good about it. In a lot of ways, I would rather a student say, hold up, bro, I can't take your word for this. Something is pulling me in another direction. I have to go clarify it experimentally. That's something that I actually honor quite a lot. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, I can't remember the last time it happened. But I do remember times where I've been like, I've left that door open, like, I can sense you're resistant to something about this. If you feel like you need to go put in a month and do it the other way, I know when it happens. It happens when I give guys that ultimatum that they're forcing aggression. Because I can never prove that the way that you're forcing aggression is negative EV for you. We've seen that happen on the streams. But what I can prove is that the reasons that you're doing it seem compulsive and compensatory and assumptive in nature. And the very fact that you insist on being the guy that forces the river triggers in unclear spots shows me that there's something imbalanced about the paradigm that you operate from. I also know that I've worked through that paradigm, but I did it experimentally. Like I could never prove, because I never had a large enough mass data analysis, that all of these spots I was pulling triggers on were actually negative EV bluffs. I never had the proof for that. I don't think anyone ever really will. But what I did have was long-term results and a lot of pots that I'd lost pulling triggers in session reviews every day where I didn't feel good about them, and I also knew I wasn't winning money overall, not nearly as much as I wanted to be. So for me, it was an experimental shift where I was just like, all right, you know what? Fuck it. I'm going in this direction for a consistent period of time, and then I will compare. So that's what I have, I guess, that serves as sort of a substitute for being able to present mass database analysis in every direction. Is I have experience with a bunch of different paradigms as a player myself, and where I've ended up is where I think it's the ending point, or at least the futuristic point of the journey through the other paradigms that I believe to be less balanced. I also know that I was the type of person who was extremely stubborn along that journey, and I know the value of actually proving myself wrong, because to prevent yourself from going through a real regression over the course of your career, I think it's necessary to prove yourself wrong a lot of the time. Otherwise, you're not convinced that you shouldn't go back. So I think that's one thing. Like, if you guys sense that I have more of a conviction than you, or that I'm more decisive than you, that's only because I fucked up so many times with so many other experimental patterns. And it's why I see no better substitute for a successful journey than experimenting with a lot of stuff. But you do have to be able to take feedback from your environment at a certain point, deduce whether or not you have a large enough sample not necessarily of hands, but of environmental feedback for you to pivot and make a new trajectory shift and go with that based on gut and trust it. 30-second drill for sure. I think there might be a run at once video up today. That's part 2 of that. I have to check. 30-second drill is something that sort of came to fruition organically out of the mental game pack, working with guys who were already sort of accustomed to looking through hands in terms of data point analysis. I basically turned it into a game. The mental game pack is all about demonstrating how there are a lot of different data points that are going undetected in hands that we can use to draw conceptual decisions from. Like a lot of that is combined with mass database analysis, which is why the night vision pack is sort of the complement to the mental game pack, because I made the mental game pack with certain mass database knowledge already. Now the night vision pack is contextualizing that so that you guys have the ability to integrate it and then use those data points in game. Now, when I did the 30-second drill, it was basically me allowing students who already had certain data point training to be able to practice on the spot with me as if we're simulating a river spot, for instance, where you have 30 seconds on the clock, give or take. And I thought it would be really helpful to put them in a high pressure training environment where they're sort of under the gun to mention the most priority data points at any single point in the hand, usually on the river. Basically a way for them to get their thought process straight so that they're focused on the things that actually allow them to make the most accurate decisions at the critical point in the hand. So it's something that the Run At Once community seemed to really like with the last video I put out, and I decided to make a more advanced one, which will go out either today or next week, I forget. But it seems to be something really helpful for guys who are sort of visual learners and who like to be put in practice in the training process. And so it's kind of the direction that I'm interested in terms of scaling my coaching style. Is I want to put a lot of attention on creating more of these types of drills that can simulate the biases that guys fall under so frequently in game that sabotage their thought process. Because the thing is, like, as a coach, what you realize is sometimes you have students who train better than they play, meaning that if they're not under a high intensity situation in a lesson, they tend to be better at talking about the game than they are at playing when they are under the high intensity situation. So I think there's an aspect of the simulation that's extremely potent in terms of training the player up to the caliber that he actually should be playing at. I think I said that right, yeah. That, like, I would rather know that my student is able to think under pressure than that he's able to leisurely talk about the hand from a bystander perspective. That's what I think the value of it is. Yeah, it's not really like a dead set checklist, but there are like a handful of questions that you should be asking yourself on rivers that come up pretty frequently depending on the exact spot. One example, for instance, is like if you have a bluff catcher on the river or an apparent bluff catcher, one of the first things you ask yourself is, do I dominate a substantial portion of the villain's value betting range? Because that's a very relevant data point in the sense it can cut the whole decision tree off if you find out that you dominate a portion of the hands he might be betting. In the sense that it immediately collapses the game tree from a theoretical point of view, because usually whenever we dominate certain value hands in his range, we almost always have a call. Now there are exceptions to that, because if he's not bluffing at all or not nearly enough, we could still be dominating some hands and find a fold. But it's stuff like that where, like, if you identify the most relevant data point at a certain point in the hand, it actually could allow you to stop thinking altogether in terms of trying to piece together other parts of other information that's taken place early in the hand. Sometimes there is one data point that should be focused on more than any to make the final decision. Looks like it's up on Run At Once, so you guys can check that out if you have the Elite sub. This I would fold. It's just equity games, really. I would call ace king, I would fold ace queen suited. I would call pocket jacks barely, I think. Cool. No problem. Three bet. Caller from the small blind. Caller from the UTG. We can't fold. He could potentially have some portion of ace king and maybe even some merge stuff. I'm just not ready to put him on enough sets for the potential. Like, this is one of those spots, Rounder, where like I can't say with high enough confidence that I don't dominate some of the hands that he should check raise in a spot where I don't really think a check raising range should exist at a very high frequency for him at all to begin with. That doesn't mean he can't have sets, but also like I guess he can have. I was gonna say pre-flop we should discount him, but after this guy calls, then it makes more sense he would call with all of his sets. But basically here, like even though he might be massively under bluffing, I can't necessarily say that I can take him off of all dominated hands. Let's make that more clear. I can't say that he's bluffing with so few dominated hands that I could argue for an exploitative fold, because I just don't have that type of confidence. I see crazy shit here often enough that I would have to find the call. And if he does have ace king, which still makes up a decent amount, a handful of combos at least, then already that's enough to justify the call. He could clearly have kings, he could have sets. I wonder if all of his sets would check rip turn. I mean, we're getting assumptive at that point, but the point is he's polarized enough, and I think he could have some dominated value. I'm just not ready to fold my aces. 200 BBs deep, things get way different, because now it gets way less likely that he's making a merge jam error, and our pot odds get way worse. So it's both. So this hand thinks is okay. It'd be too assumptive to do anything else, I think. I think we could find 3 barrels here. I think the queen's going to put a decent amount of pressure on a player who will overfold ace queen on the turn. And I think a lot of guys will have a lot of busted draws here. The data point that there's double two-tone on board and that we have 8 high, so we never have any check back equity, makes me very much want to bluff this to get him off of, like, you know, any Broadway hearts diamonds that are unpaired, any ace-x diamond draws. So I think I would barrel this, and I like that you did. I hope it was for the reasons I said. Usually I don't think this is like a hot spot to barrel 3, but I think we do put a lot of pressure on parts of his range that's very advantageous for us to fold. Squeeze was okay in that ace-queen hand, for sure. This looks fine. So yes, I still bluff rivers. What's this guy doing? So we ISO. This guy check calls flop, donks turn. Because of the quality of our hand being below second pair, I'm just going to find the fold right here. So again, it's one of those spots where if I call turn, I'm going to call river very consistently, and I don't want to be using a hand that's so weak that I am losing to a significant portion of his potential merge hands. Now, if I knew this guy was wild enough, I could probably still call and call most rivers. But just in a vacuum, I think I'm going to sort of draw the line here and just expect to print a lot of money when I have like a good 8 or better. Good, I like the fold. When I want to say he's merge betting turn. He's also obviously got hands like this, but keep in mind, a gutter with 2 overs pushes good equity. So just because he shows up with bluffs doesn't mean that he's in balance with bluffs when he's betting an equity-driven range. Again, it's something that this is the main thing. It's something that you should expect, that he has bluffs in his range. Hope I didn't just break my phone. The bigger problem is that you can't call to fold river versus a player type like this, because too many of these guys are going to be bluffing rivers. That's just what they do. So now you have a situation where you either have to call sevens to call river or fold sevens right away. These fishies are owning. So I agree with the fold here. And realize like the weaker your hand gets in terms of the pair, the more susceptible you are to an equity-driven bluffing combination improving on you. I would just flat here. I think 3-betting is actually okay with how much people overfold, so I get why you're doing it. I think we talked about this last lesson too, and I gave you the green light. Bet call flop is standard. I'm folding turn on this card especially. I think it's connecting way too many of his potential semi-bluffs from the flop. And again, it's going to be a spot similar to last hand, where now that I no longer believe I'm dominating any of his value, I'm either crushed or I'm drawing versus a range that's pushing a lot of equity, a bluffing range that's pushing a lot of equity, because it's pretty hard for him to have a poorly randomized bluff in this spot on this turn card. So I like the fold. What's he show? 2-pair. He's c-betting the flop just based on a simplified, well-balanced strategy of 1/3 that I basically advocate to all my students because it makes life easy while still playing very close to a balanced strategy that doesn't sacrifice a lot of EV compared to a PO solver optimal suggestion. Optimal. Basically, the point behind recommending the one strategic option, 1/3 c-bet simplification, is that it doesn't put guys in a situation where they lose control of their range as frequently. So they tend to have a little bit more vision over the lines that they will be playing often, since they're totally taking the checking option out of their game to begin with. It lets them get to the turn more likely with more balance because they have more vision over their range as opposed to having to split the range up immediately from the flop. So basically, you're massively simplifying the game tree when you reduce strategic options from the flop, which I think is definitely beneficial to guys who are still sort of like getting familiar with range versus range interaction and have a tendency to compound mistakes out of position in large pots. I think that if you eliminate as many strategic options from the flop, you reduce the chance that you're going to compound mistakes because you're more familiar with the lines that you're playing and the ranges that you're playing in those lines. Yeah, this I think is a definite stab. Brian's been doing some more MDA research here on different type of player profiles and how often they call river. This doesn't stand out to me as a great spot to just barrel for 2/3. Kind of looks like an okay spot to like overbet in the vacuum. I do think he'll have like a portion of ace queen, ace jack, and then the rest of his range will be like medium pocket pairs. So the turn barrel I think is mandatory. The turn stab is mandatory. The river bet I think is sort of so-so in a multi-way pot. So I don't feel strongly about the river bet. I do expect that hand to fold, which is kind of weird. Wonder if he had a note on you. Twin scat, yeah, I would say you're right about that. I feel like I saw this hand, Logan, from last time. Oh, looks like we're about out of time too. Maybe I didn't see this hand. I would think I would prefer that you barrel turn as opposed to check call. That being said, I still think check call would be recommended by a solver if we did get here. And now it's just a really clear check fold because I don't think this is a card that gets bluffed nearly often enough versus the check call range that you're kind of repping. I guess that part's intuitive. Like this is probably the most intuitive part of my game is sensing what rivers get checked too frequently. I definitely have some MDA backed up from that, but a lot of it is basically intuiting how my check call range is perceived and then knowing that the pool tends to default toward passivity when the integrity of the board doesn't change much. That's one way of putting it that I think is like the paradigm that most guys are in from small stakes, moving up to even mid stakes and high stakes. Like that whole spectrum is predominantly oriented toward passive barreling strategies on the river in spots where the integrity of the board doesn't change all that much. Now, you do have to be careful about applying that to everyone because there are players who will either force aggression out of compulsion or try to level that aspect of your thinking if they know that you're sort of an advanced level thinker. On Bovada, I don't think you have to worry about that because it's relatively vacuumed. But these are kind of things that tend to require more attention as you're moving up in limits versus players who are capable of detecting certain parts of your overall blueprint strategy and then trying to turn them on you. There's nothing really you can do about that except try to stay as aware as possible of the information being exchanged. And I'll end on that because I think that's one of the things that most guys are paranoid about, which is the sustainability of highly exploitative strategies. But that's only because most guys don't trust themselves to calibrate or compile information exchanges over the course of days, weeks, months with certain regulars at their limit, and then either decide whether or not they want to make continuous counter strategies to what that guy is doing to adjust to them, or if they want to simply move back toward more of a well-balanced strategy versus the more creative or observant regs at the limit. Realize you have the potential to do both. Like, you can either go to war with the guys that seem to be trying to pick your strategy apart, or since you do have familiarity with equilibrium because you're studying in a way that still honors equilibrium, you can actually just revert back to your best attempt at well-balanced strategies and just try to play sort of like not soft versus the better regs at the limit, but like they're not on your radar for why you're there when you sit down every day. Like, I would guess that in most high stakes environments and even maybe some good MSNL environments, especially if you're playing with consistent regs, like guys who know your screen name, 20 to 30% of the pool are the types of players that you don't really go in gunning against with exploitative blueprint strategies. Maybe in some way, maybe in some small ball lines, but like for the most part, I think that you're definitely going to have to play a little bit more solid versus certain portions of your pool. There's nothing wrong with that. The only reason there would be something wrong with that is if you had an idea in your head that you needed to pronounce yourself as the best regular at your limit. But that's just ego talking, and that has nothing to do with your overall win rate. The best reg at the limit is technically the guy who gets out of the limit as fast as possible. Another paradigm shift that most guys don't understand. I have no intentions of establishing myself as the best 3-6 player or even the best 5-10 player on stars, because guess what? I'd rather have a 15 BB win rate at Bovada and diversify to 3 other networks, where I can play a much more exploitative blueprint strategy with great sustainability, with higher hourly rate, maybe even better rake back if you get on one of those other sites. So this is my whole style now, in case you're just like seeing the stream for the first time, is like I'm much more interested in strategy development that scales to like greater and greater market diversity than I am with like the ego shell of like, oh, I gotta get to be the best at this limit, or I gotta get to the next limit on my site so I can establish my screen name as the one that, has more authority on the run at once forums. Like, fuck all that, dude. If you're here for money so that you can have greater freedom, and if you want to actually become a better problem solver, then start thinking about the more inclusive picture, which is how do I get better at approaching problems intelligently by working at them from one paradigm up, because that's where I'm headed anyway. And then how do I use that to scale into markets that have a wider cap? I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I've told you guys that basically at the end of last year, I made the decision I was either going to go into coaching small stakes through high stakes players and make that like my total thesis of poker, or I was going to try to shoot for nosebleeds. And the thing that's developed for me since that decision, besides the fact that I'm much more inspired to just have like genuine connection with more people, and I just like doing this stuff more, rather than be alone and fucking like studying intensely on high stakes guys who were also very creative, who were also closer to being able to playing equilibrium strategies and countering me. I saw a very low cap on that market unless I wanted to put in a very high amount of annoying, not inspired work. But also, I came to the conclusion that like the market of nosebleed poker is so fucking minuscule compared to where else you can basically launch into your career once you have good market problem solving skills. Like I would much rather go find some private investor who's doing, day trading or something like that. Like I met this kid at a bachelor party who's like 24 and he's like, dude, I'm making 60K a month off of day trading on 4 patterns that if you had, you would see how simple this is. And I'm like, holy fuck, dude. Like this kid does a tenth of the work that even probably you guys do. And just because he's a little more hip to Intel or something, he has a bankroll, he's able to pump out numbers like this. I'm like, this whole shit is crazy if you're doing it from a money perspective. Now I can't say that I am, but I am doing it from a perspective that wants to scale towards something that's a little bit more um, inclusive, I would say. Like I don't like the idea that I'd put myself in a position to be in a market for a very long that I thought was extremely capped. I like to keep my options open in that way. So just something to think about in terms of your career perspective. It's something I put in the mental game pack too, that like a lot of you guys might be under the delusion that everything would be great if you got to nosebleeds, but like then you're going to be 30 and realize that the most you can make is $1 million or $2 million a year if you're like probably one of the very best. So yeah, that's awesome. And it's really awesome if you still love to play poker, but you've got to take other things into consideration. Like I'm 30 and I don't necessarily have the inspiration to sit down and be a grinder anymore. Things change when you get older, and if you're not working on your problem solving skills on the way up, I think you're doing yourself a disservice with the amount of options you keep open along the way. So don't want to like project anything onto you guys, but keep it in mind, because if you're not at least considering it, you're setting yourself up to have a rude awakening in a few years by the time you're 30. I think I'm pretty old for the industry, so. Okay, last question. How would you recommend one does not fall into the trap of seeking the results of a hand that was anomaly and allowing it to affect our future decision-making process? In other words, given the nature of the spots we saw today where there's some strange min check raise anomaly, one could come away thinking I should call down more. How do we keep from getting into the faulty mental process? Mass database analysis. Simple as that. The only way to override bias is to cleanse it with something that completely destroys all objections. Like the only reason that you have a tendency to be results oriented when you see an anomaly is because you don't have the data of that exact line and how often it's bluffed side by side with it over a 30 million hand sample of it. Like there's very few people who are stubborn enough that if you show them a 30 million hand sample that says don't call in this spot based on what the alias is doing, would continue to call. And those people probably deserve to lose because that's a level of arrogance that shouldn't really be tolerated for winners. So yeah, it can all be solved through the mass database analysis. And as someone who comes from a very stubborn background, I can say that's what drew me toward this direction. I was like, well, you know what? Since I'm so logical, like I always thought I was a very logical person because I needed the proof. And in a way that was true, but in a way that was stubborn and held me back from actually making shifts in my learning pattern that could have got me places more quickly. For instance, getting out of the theory-oriented paradigm. But now what I see is that it's very necessary to help the community who also is stuck in the logic-based paradigm. I actually used the right usage of that just now. It's helpful to be able to bridge them from a context that already makes sense to them in their language. Like you guys want to see proof. One of the most common things that I see from the emails I get is like, I'm one of those guys that needs to see it before I believe it. And I get that because that's where I come from, and that's why I feel like the night vision pack is going to be the shit, because it's the first time where we have so much organization around so many millions of hands, and you can plot it for any environment, making it versatile to wherever you're at in your market, to give you blueprint strategies that are beyond a reasonable doubt better than what you're currently deploying, because we're looking at the hotspots, which are only the massive deviations. So is there room for error? Yes. Is there room for error to the point where a 7% or more hotspot is subject to some sort of variance that we didn't account for? Probably not. Very slim chance. Mass data analysis is the fastest way to cleanse bias because it's the only thing that makes sense to the person who thinks they're operating logically under some sort of scientific premise to begin with, which is most of the community. Most of the community is like, we need a bigger sample before we can change. Okay, well, here's your fucking sample. 100 million. Okay, guys. I don't know what's next in terms of the next stream. I'm going away for the weekend to a Christmas party. I'm going to drink a lot of Prosecco and eat some filet mignon. I hope you guys enjoy the family time. Christmas is coming. I wish I was in a warmer place, but I'm suffering in Syracuse, New York. Until then, check out the blog. Coming up in a couple of days, I'm going to start releasing hand-to-note stuff. Let's get the promo code out real quick for those of you guys who didn't pick up hand-to-note yet. Give me 1 second. This will give you 10% off on your hand-to-note purchase and also help me out by entering you into my affiliate category. So I'll paste the link and I'll paste the promo code you can use. If you don't know what hand-to-note is, it's going to be the next database thing that takes over the industry. I feel as strongly about it as I did when I was beta testing like GTO Range Builder around the time when PO Solver just basically stomped it because they did better marketing and had a faster processor. That's the link. I recommend you buy. The full year will save you money, but you need the $40 a month quality one. I think it's called Edge. Brian, please confirm if you're there. I really should know by now. But what you're going to want for night vision if you plan on picking it up, or even if you plan to just get max utility out of hand-to-note, is the best version they have because it's got really good functionality. So here's the promo code, pasting it now in the chat. You can use that, get 10% off your initial purchase. I think that's it. Love you guys. Merry Christmas early. See you on, I think, the 23rd, but I'll have to check the schedule. Peace.